What's up, gang? Welcome to The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius. Boy, do we have a special guest. Jaclyn Lindsey's in the house. What's up, Jaclyn?
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. It's early here in California, and I'm like, my wife and kids are like, dude, is he doing podcasts again early? I'm like, I am. So excited.
Honored it's for me. Good to see you.
I know. I'm like, last night, I'm like, oh man, should I email her? But the audience isn't gonna know this. I think I rescheduled our last one, so I'm like, I'm not doing that again. Like, so here we are. I'm so excited to have you on the show. So I met Jaclyn at GOT, and the audience knows I always talk about GOT. They're like, man, this guy always talks about GOT, but I always do because it's such an important event in my life. And so I met her here at GOT at MIT this year, and I was like, oh, you gotta come on the show. And we have a mutual background of grew up going to raves, and now we're doing awesome things in the world. And man, I'm just so excited to have you here on the show today, Jaclyn.
Thank you, Darius. I'm really, really excited to be here with you.
Well, so for audience members who are not familiar with Jaclyn's work, I'm going to give your formal bio. So Jaclyn is the co-founder and CEO of kindness.org, which is her amazing organization we're talking about today. She's the author of Be Kind. She's helped raise more than $100 million for domestic and international missions. And on the personal side, she's a globetrotter and adventurer with her husband, Mansell, and her two boys. So such an impressive and awesome human being, and really getting to learn your story at GOT was one highlight for me this year. But, like most people, we don't just end up kind of where we're at right now. That we always have these really interesting stories and journeys to get there. And your journey is really an awesome journey. And like all awesome journeys, you have that hero's journey, those ups and downs. But I'd love if we like origin stories here at The Greatness Machine. I'd love it if you could kind of give our audience a little bit of your origin story. How did you get to where you got to?
How young do you want to start?
Yeah, no. I think go early. It's all good.
Yeah, I've started to look at the narrative of my life almost by decades. And the first decade, I really felt born to change the world. I had a passion to help people and a love of serving and giving. And I also had big ambitions. I was a natural entrepreneur. And then in middle school and on into high school, I went through some really difficult things that tested my stamina and resilience, learned a lot about who I was, and fell into a really dark, depressive time, and barely made it to 20. But I did. And there's a lot maybe we'll get into around that specific time in my life. But really out of it, realized I wanted to get back to the purpose of why I was here. And so I've spent the better part of the past 20 years pursuing that work in the nonprofit space. And throughout it, I kept landing on human kindness as the most important thing we had. It was certainly the most important thing I had in my life. It was both the greatest asset, but also unkindness could be our greatest adversary. And so I wanted to dedicate my life to somehow building a kinder world, spending my time and energy thinking about what that meant and what that looked like. But it's all because of what I kind of experienced in that second decade of my life.
So let me ask you a question. God, that was a really brief origin story on what is we're gonna go deeper on some of this stuff, because I'm like, wow, that's you went briefer than I thought you'd go. So I'm going to dig into some of that stuff. So first of all, kindness is, it's such an important like part of just being a human, right? Like if I was to pick like two emotions that I think like represent the best of human, like kindness is one of them, and love is the other one. And really, kindness is comes out of love, right? Love being like the root of it, and kindness is just that expression towards someone else of love, and in a way that's just like really seeing them and wanting to help and be there for other people. That's at least my like off the cuff like description of kindness. Do you kind of see it the same way, or like how do you when you say kindness, what does kindness mean to you?
Yeah, I do see it that way. We define kindness as a meta value. And so it encompasses love being, of course, one of the number one things we would think of, but also acts of justice and fairness and gratitude and empathy. Kindness is the expression of all of those different tenets. And the power of kindness, it's both something we feel, like you said, a feeling, but it's also an action. It's a choice. We're choosing every single day how we're showing up and treating others, treating ourselves, treating people we don't know. And that act is what I'm most interested in when it comes to how kindness shows up in our world, is that agency and choice we have as humans everywhere around the world. So we define it at kindness.org as an action intended to benefit others, and typically at a cost. So we do try and educate people. The meme or Instagram image we might see, kindness is free, throw it like confetti. It's like, sometimes it's really hard to choose kindness, and it can take our mental energy. It can take money. It can take our time. And so we don't want to undermine the power and potency of that.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were saying all that, I was thinking about like the moments when I'm kind, when I want to rip someone's face off, and I'm like, and I'm actually not that great at it. It's a lot easier for me to just like, all right, clothes are off now. I'm just gonna kill you, right? And I have that part of me that like when that is definitely a part that's like it's a protection part where I'm like, oh, okay, like I'll be good. I don't know about the other person, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I've found as I've gotten older, in the past, that was actually like I was very like proud of that. I'm like, oh, well, I can always protect myself. So like, if someone fucks with me, like, fucking kill them, you know. But I'm not going to go there first, and I'm not going to start it. But if like it ends up there, it ends up there, and that a lot of that came from wounds, right? Of like people fucking with me, or people starting shit with me, or people being mean to me, or people abusing me, right? And then that was a reaction to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as I've gotten older, and this is really new, this is probably in the last like year, where I'm like, I'm not going to kill them. Like that is actually what they're doing is coming from a place of pain, right? So it's actually it's the first time in probably my whole life where I've actually respected that, where I'm like, wow, for someone to try to injure me in this way, what happened to them for them to be coming out, like putting that out in the world, right? And then to be empathetic and to say like, and not, and actually like see them as a human as opposed to like an adversary. That's been a new thing where I'm like, well, what if I was curious right now instead of just an asshole back, right? And so the cost is I'm like, intuitively, I want to kill them, right?
Yeah.
But personally, I'm like, wow, that they're just this is a wounded person that I'm trying to like maybe actually like give some credit to right now. So I don't know. How's that land for you?
It's landing. And I really appreciate that honesty. I think exactly what you're saying is probably what so many of your listeners are saying. Like, yeah, it's hard to get there. When you get there, it changes everything, because most of us, myself included, I became the worst version of myself. I became someone I didn't like out of defending myself, protecting myself, trying to not allow myself to feel the hurt and pain that I was going through by others growing up. And I think we all are reacting in what we know and what we don't know. And I think when you can get to a place where you realize that, and you realize we're all human first, we're all carrying a story, we're all coming out. Some people, billions of people potentially, would much rather be in your place today than where they are. Their trauma and their experiences, fighting hunger, starvation, war, like, we're all but we're all in this world together, and it's complicated and messy. But if we can start with that willingness to see that person as a human with a story, imagine what would happen if we all started adapting how we show up. So yeah, it's really resonant, and definitely a lot of how we think about how this work shows up in the world.
So kind of going to this idea that this is a meta, what did you call it again? A meta value. Sorry.
Yeah.
All right. So I love that. So I don't know if we talked about this. So I wrote a book called Core Value Equation. So I'm like a core value evangelist, right?
Okay.
Like I'm about as hardcore about values as you can be. Well, everyone's all about values, but I just took the time to actually write a book about it. So I hadn't thought about values in terms of meta value versus like it's just a non-meta value. But when you say meta value, does it mean it's encompassing? It's a large value that encompasses other values. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, precisely. So that you can have niche things. Let's say justice. Justice manifests in a really specific way, and people think maybe about the criminal justice system or social justice or something like that. But love, people may not think love and justice are one and the same. And to us, to me, kindness is all of it. It's showing up with fairness for someone is an example of choosing kindness, gratitude, forgiveness. So in and of itself, each of those values stand alone as something we know, we understand, we can identify with it. And we see kindness as this umbrella that all of those things are nested under. And it's probably, we think, arguably the only thing that can do that. Love could maybe do it, but love, to your point at the beginning, it's an expression of kindness. It's how the act is showing up. And so it's really about that behavior and that choice to do those things, to choose justice, fairness, forgiveness, gratitude, etc.
So like, I think that we live in a world of like imperfect humans, right? And so a lot of this stuff, I think, like as we're talking about it, I'm like, we're probably both, at least I'm feeling this, like, oh, I feel good. Like we're talking about these amazing things. And I had a guest on the show the other day, and we were talking about how the words we choose really create the realities we live within. Mm-hmm. And we just have a choice of at the end of the day of, what words are we choosing to either say to others or say to ourselves? And, probably 98% of our conversations are had internally anyway,
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea around choosing kindness as a way to live your life is just a choice that can then create this exponential effect of those around you, right? And it's hard because, like even this weekend, I'm dating this show depending on when the show comes out, but this weekend, like someone tried to assassinate one of our presidential candidates, right? I'm like, now, if you're going to choose kindness, you're going to look at both sides of that and be like, whoa, that the person that took that attempt was like a troubled person because they're either like mentally not there and they were really afraid of what was happening, or B, they're just like wanted to take someone else out, which says a lot about that person, right? On the other side of it, you have a dude that was just, doing his thing, whether you agree with it or not politically, basically had a bullet shot at him. I'm like, none of that's kindness. Yeah. like there's no kindness on any of that. And a lot of that's coming from, we're a divided country right now, unfortunately. There's a lot of people like being unkind to each other constantly. It's part of the culture we're in right now. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear, like, just, without being political, I'm just using that as an example because I think it's a pretty extreme example. Yeah. Like, how do you feel like as culturally, how we are, because I think that like intrapersonally, I think people can choose kindness very easily. I do think culturally, we're in this kind of weird position right now where people are not being very kind to each other. How do you guys see that?
Yeah, it's a really big, complicated area. And so I want to caveat and say, these are just some perspectives and ways we've thought about it and approached it. And I want to acknowledge, well, I'm only thinking of the line, "There's no silver bullet," which feels somewhat inappropriate and also perhaps totally appropriate. But yeah, there's no single thing because of the complexity of something like this. Same thing with war. But we do think deeply about it. And we've tried really hard to tackle these issues with the best way we know how. Our work is really always starting with the science and what we understand about largely the psychology of people, the development of people. One thing we did several years ago, actually in response to what was happening in the 2020 election, we funded some really provocative research that looked at how do you help effective polarization, and how do you go in and contribute to what's happening on Republican versus Democrat across party lines. And this research focused on loving kindness meditation. And there was a control group. There was the group that had regular, just 10-minute meditation each day. And then each group, Republican and Democrats that engaged in this study, they had to do a loving kindness meditation towards someone of the opposite party affiliation. And we can share this for the show notes, but it was unbelievable, the significant effect that we had on effective polarization through kindness meditation. So that's one example of ways that if you want to be someone who's willing to unite and be open to perspective, I think what's interesting right now is people say that they want to be in a democracy and they want to be able to dialogue and they want to be able to have healthy tension, healthy conflict, but that's not what we're actually seeing. We're seeing people who want to fight and war with each other. But rising above that is saying, I recognize that you think you're right. That's the thing. It's like both sides think they're right. And so it's more about how are we coming in, having perspective for the other person and going back to seeing them as a person first versus a color, red or blue. So complicated. That's one example and way that we've looked at how could we change the climate we're in right now. And I think it is about healthy dialogue, creating containers for safe discussions with people, making sure you're coming at it with an eye toward healing and unification, not toward more division. That's asking a lot of people, to be honest.
Yeah, no. And it's also hard when, I'm trying my hardest not to make this political, but I'm going to say this from like a leadership standpoint. If the rhetoric of the candidates is divisive, then you're going to get divisive behavior. So like words matter, right? So if we're going back to this idea that what I say is my reality, and if the reality is we're pointing the finger and calling they're bad, they're ruining the country, and it's being done on both sides, then it's like, okay, well then like there's no, like you can't just suddenly press the pause button and be like, but we need to be unified. It's like, no, motherfucker, you are like literally pointing the finger and saying that you're bad. Yeah. And I was talking, I live in Texas, which is a very red state, but I live in Austin, which is a very blue city. And my family lives in California, so they're very liberal and left leaning, and they give me a hard time. They're like, "Oh, you're a closet Republican," and I'm like, no, I'm actually an independent. I don't like what either side's saying. They're like, "Oh no, they're talking shit and calling me names and names in their book, which is calling me basically saying I'm right leaning, and I'm like, let me just put it this way. What you're suggesting is polarizing, right? And the fact that you feel this way, just know that like there's no winning. Like you don't win if 38% of the country is in full disagreement with who's in charge. And you don't win if who's running the country has the backing of 38% of the country and the other, whatever that number is, 62% wishes you weren't there. Like that's the definition of polarization, right? So like no one wins because it's just that you get the seesaw effect. And I think you touched on something that was really important, which is it's this empathy, right? It's this really important part of kindness, which is empathy, right? Which is at least what I heard. And I used to have this like I've always done this, by the way, in business, because in business, and I don't know, like what did you have a really big business experience before you did the kindness stuff? Were you working in business? I forget your background there.
Oh no, I've only been in the nonprofit social impact space, so a different kind of business. But yeah.
So that's going to be much more. It's going to be it's going to be different than traditional business. So traditional business, you have this like concept of like sales versus ops, right? The people out there like kind of bringing in the money are always kind of at odds with the back office, who has to like have the rules and the process, and the two don't go hand in hand, mostly because the type of person that's good at sales is bad at ops, and the type of person that's bad at ops is bad at sales. So they have this complete disrespect for each other, because the ops person's like, oh, I could do what they do, but I'm choosing to do what I do. And the salesperson's like, I don't want to do what they do, but they don't even understand what I do. And so you end up with this like total natural tension in every business that sometimes it's very toxic, where they don't work well together. And it's a common issue in business. And what I used to do to overcome this is I'd take my salespeople, I'd fly them in. I'm like, you're going to sit in the office today and you're going to like stack files. You're literally going to like do administrative work with the ops team. And then I make the ops team go in the field and I make them drive around with the salespeople to go meet people.
Wow.
And it always right away eliminated the issues. Yeah. They start working better together. They understood that both persons' jobs were hard in their eyes. Like, oh, I didn't realize that. And then they'd start to see like the things that they were doing to each other to make it hard for each other. But they couldn't do it unless they actually saw that, like the reality of it, right? Because in their bubbles, they'd sit there and they would just sit there and like talk shit. They're like, this person, you know, they demonize the person, they would demonize their behavior, and then they would get with people who were of their same mindset. So I'm just describing a echo chamber, and they'd talk shit together about them.
Yeah.
And then you'd end up with this natural, like kind of like crystallization of division. And I was always just really thoughtful about bringing that down. So like when I describe that to you and you start to look at kindness being this ultimate truth that everyone understands, like there's no person that's listening to this that's like, oh, this is bullshit. Like, no, the kindness is bad. No one has ever said that before. Now, people might believe that being kind sometimes is not the right choice, you know, because given the circumstances, which that's probably the better debate. But like, how do you take this type of thought process in a world that has a lot of negative energy and also has the ability to have this positive, like meta value when it's at its best? How do you create more of that so that we can have these better outcomes?
I want to first just applaud how you led, and I hope people pull a page from that. We have done a lot of work with businesses on the internal side, and it's an incredible illustration of what it takes to bring people together and solve tension, and I just really admire that. So I just think I haven't heard of a leader actually implementing something like that, and I think it says a lot about you, but also hopefully has a ripple effect out and people are willing to try something like that. And I think it illustrates a way that we think about this in the bigger landscape. We are in a world that's more connected than ever, as we know. And we can't ignore how much social media is giving influence to what we're seeing and shaping what we're digesting and what we're bringing into our minds and into our perspectives. So I would always want people to start with getting back to like the root of what it means to work collaboratively, what it means to work together, because we're all different. It's not just political. It feels very political right now because of the climate we're in. It's an election year and things feel more divisive than they ever have. And yet you can talk to people from, I don't know, the Nixon era. And they're also going to say like, no, there was nothing like that. You know, everyone's going to have a take on living through the worst of the worst kinds of things. And so it's reminding ourselves we're in one of the best times we've ever been in humanity as far as health and longevity, you know, plagues and, you know, the things we've combated, infant mortality, like we've overcome so many things by working together to solve these huge issues. And if people can remember that this is a time and it's very difficult, and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to get through all of this. We need to get back to, I believe, and would encourage people to try to get back to what feels right to you when you're making your choices. Does it feel right to go out and blame and point fingers? It usually doesn't, but there's social contagion and you feel like you're defending something. But if you can try to just think about how your choices are influencing people for good and bad, what's the legacy you want to leave? And just think about your own self. Don't worry about everyone else right now, as hard as that might be.
Yeah, I love that. So I have two questions. First of all, you said you guys did the love and meditation, like double blind study. What was the outcome of that? Can you give us that?
Yeah. So we have something called Kind Fund, where we, there's a lot of researchers out there that are smarter than us or have expertise in areas that we don't. And this was a group that had been doing a lot of interesting work in the role of loving kindness within the UK government. And they wanted to test it here with Republicans versus Democrats. And ultimately, what we found at the end of this, forget how many weeks, I want to say for 4 weeks, they had to do a daily loving kindness meditation for someone on the opposite side. And at the end, that group had significant more empathy and compassion, and wanting to work together and wanting to connect with people across party lines, wanting to work collaboratively with people across party lines, versus the group that did no meditation and the group that did regular meditation, but not loving kindness specifically. And so it reminds us just the power of that one exercise, what it can do to change our perspective of someone that we might see as bad, or dare I say even evil. Like, there is a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of perspective people are putting out of the people on the other side of the aisle. But this was a reminder, if you start with just simple 10 minutes of they're a person, I don't like them, but kindness toward them, what would that look like? And it did change their behaviors and desires to want to work with them.
That's interesting. It makes sense, and again, I think there's this othering effect that that people can, no matter what, whether you're talking politically or I'm talking about just being unkind to somebody else, I have to other them.
Yeah.
I have to say, oh, they're this and I'm that, and that is better than this, and I need to enforce my will on them. And I'm like, if you could show me a great historical reference to people behaving this way and there being good outcomes, I'm waiting for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have 3,000 years of written history that disputes that ever works, right? In the long run. In the short run, it might work temporarily for one side. But then then I'll just kind of show you the next 200 years of what ends up happening. Because pissed off people, especially if you feel wronged, that has a tendency to build up, and then there's a keg pot moment where people come back at you, right? And it's usually 100-fold because depending on the injustices that have transpired. So it's not surprising that had such a good effect. Gosh, it's funny. When you were saying that, I was thinking, I heard a study. It was either a study or it was anecdotal, but basically they were talking about Congress, members of Congress, right? And so right now, which I think, again, I do think you can fix all these things if you just fundamentally approach this from a perspective of empathy and kindness, right? Where you're like, okay, because there's a great quote by Charlie Munger, which is, you show me someone's incentives, I'll show you their behavior, right? And so if you take that and I literally do this in business, I'm like, what's the incentive structure? Anything I want to fix in business, I'm like, what's the incentive structure? What are they actually incentivized to do? And 99.99999% of the time, if I have an outcome I don't like, it's because the incentive structure is broken. And sometimes there's a values issue. I'll have a broken incentive structure and I'll have a person there that's not misaligned from a values perspective. And I'm like, yeah, well, no wonder I'm getting a bad result, right? So using that perspective and talking about the way Congress has been set up, in Congress, you used to have to live in DC with your family. This is probably since when we were kids. When we were kids, you had to live in DC with your family. So so what happens is people get elected, they have to move their families to Washington DC from wherever they live. You live in Kansas, or you live in Iowa, or you live in California. Your family moves to DC, and you fly home for your constituents to do work, and then you go back to DC where you live, right? None of this, by the way, doesn't sound insane to me, because they work for the United States government. For us, we're paying them, and the office is in the fucking DC. It's not in, that's where the office is. So I'm like, okay, well, if you want to take a job, sometimes you have to relocate for it. So I don't think no one who's listening to this right now is some people might be like, really? I didn't realize they don't live in DC. No, they don't. They live in California now. But back, up until, I think it's up until 20 or 30 years ago. I think it's 30 years ago when this changed. They'd moved to DC. Their kids would all have to go to school together. So if your kids go to school with someone else, with your adversary's kids, you're not going to go to that school event and be an asshole to them. You're going to be forced to go to the games. You're going to be forced to go to the fundraisers for the school. You're going to be forced to be in the same neighborhoods because you're not going to live on another side of town because the Republicans live on one side and Democrats live on the other. They all like kind of are like in the same similar socioeconomic situations. They're joining the same country clubs, right? Because that's a lot of those folks do. They're eating at the same restaurants. So if you're in an environment where you're doing all that, it is really hard for you to walk past someone and give them, shoot bullets at them with your eyes. You could do it in the chambers of Congress, no problem. You can't do it if you're doing it socially constantly. Yeah. So what ended up happening was you had, and I think I don't know the data offhand, but this was told me the data was insane. How much more bipartisanship that you had up until this change happened. And the change that happened was they all started moving back to their hometowns. Why? Show me incentives, I'll show you the behavior. Because it became around fundraising during term. They were constantly fundraising during term because they're trying to get reelected. And so since they're trying to reelected, now they're like, well, I got to live at home because all my constituents live at home and all I care about is getting reelected. And the only thing that does that is me fundraising, and I'm fundraising the minute I get elected for my next term. And so that has been one of the massive shifts. And I looked at that and I was like, oh, well, of course you're not going to be kind to somebody. You have no incentive to be. Your incentive is to get reelected. And the only way you get reelected is by backing the people who are going to give you money. And the people who give you money have a perspective that they want pushed into law, right? And that's your job. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your take on this, but that everything we've been talking about, I was like, oh, this seems like such an easy fix to me. Like, you want to like mitigate the bipolar, like the polarization of the polarization of our country. I'm like, I think it's super simple. Term limits, you have to live in DC. Done. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I +1 that, and admittedly feel quite ignorant to everything you're saying. So I need to go away and like learn more about it, because I didn't actually know that history or when it changed. And I would be curious to look at like data of if there's a way to somehow connect it. And I don't know if it would even be correlational or causal if it could get there, but are there links we could see with what starts to happen when they're no longer together? Because I think you're totally right. If you can go, it keeps coming back to, for me, seeing the person first. I'm also in a red state. I moved to Florida from New York, and I'm in a little city sliver of blue amongst a huge, we know Florida.
Sea of red.
Red. And coming here, even in this work, I came here and I was quite like defensive and had myself like up in arms about how would I live and how would I make it. And I had this really interesting perspective where in hindsight, I'm like, wait a minute, you show up and you just love the people around you no matter what. And some days are harder than others, depending on things I've seen or what I'm surrounded by. But for the most part, it's like I'm still living in a community with people. And we have different perspectives, certainly, but some are my neighbors. Some have their signs out, and are very passionate about things differently than me. But when you're together societally, communally, it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be so divisive because there's so many other things connecting you. So yeah, my take is I agree. Merging lives, perspectives, that is where change can happen. We're going to have the tension. So people are going to be on a spectrum. We're often going to be exposed to the very extreme sides of the spectrum, just based on what, again, going back to social media and what are the things that are out there being perpetuated. But if you look at the majority being in the middle, or majority wanting to not be so extreme, if we can try to get back into that kind of center ground, that's healthy. It's okay to have that kind of tension.
Yeah, totally. So I want to take a huge step back, because I think that, again, having this and I didn't mean for this to be such a political conversation, so I apologize. This is probably a sign of the times, right? This is a political year, so Jaclyn's taking it on the chin because I'm thinking about political stuff so much. So thank you for entertaining this conversation. But I want to take a huge step back, because I think that to come out the way that you have, We wrote a book, Be Kind. You are the CEO of kindness.org. Like, this is an extreme perspective on this meta value that, you know, I and I know your background and your history, like that does, like, that's not a normal thing to like dive into head first. Like what do you think it, like, is it about, was this like you going to like the 7-year-old self and saying, hey, I know that was like the most important thing to you? Or is this a really more of a reaction to what the life that you led up until this was all born? Like what creates this? Like, if every action is, what's the law in physics? Like, every action is, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. If this is the reaction, what was the action that created this reaction? I'd love for you to kind of educate us, or at least give us your thoughts on how this reaction came from what action.
It's a really great question. I do credit my parents for really instilling me at a young age a belief that we had this saying, you don't look down on anyone unless you're helping them up. And it was never about someone's paycheck or pocketbook or title. It was about the person and their story. And we had diverse, dinner table conversations, and always an open door where everyone was welcomed. And I have so many memories of just seeing my parents love every person, treat everyone with respect and kindness. And they gave me that passion. And I, thinking I would do good in the world, I actually wanted to be first woman president. And so at a young age, living in Key West, was kind of the little mayor of the town. And my grandparents loved to tell stories of how I would come to them with my plan to be first woman president, and could I count on their vote, and explaining my vision. And it really, at that time, it was a belief about helping people, and just very innocent and naive in that. And then in middle school, what happened is I got bullied, and I think probably everyone listening has memories of things that they've gone through that were difficult. And for me, what was so interesting, Darius, is that I really thought I was wired to handle anything. I was a super tough tomboy girl. I had broken the record for track and field at my school. I was captain of soccer. I was, leading championship. Like, I was a rough and tumble girl, and like a tough kid. And I wasn't prepared for how much I was affected by kids being really cruel to me. It was largely about being poor. I was the daughter of an immigrant, and we came from very humble beginnings. So I couldn't afford a lot of the things that kids had. Poor, a lot about my looks, being called just a really ugly kid. And I didn't really have the tools to navigate what that was doing to me developmentally during those formative years. And so I looked in places to feel good about myself that was largely drinking, drugs, and men. And that led to a long period of depression and drug addiction of all sorts. And probably the most formative thing that happened is I overdosed at 19. After years of living that debaucherous life, it caught up with me. When I started working on what I had been through and trying to heal, whatever that meant at that time, it kept coming back to these core root memories I had of just feeling this depth of unkindness. And I thought, man, if I'm this kid who's wired for ambition and driven for change and leadership and entrepreneurship and all these things that just felt like pumping through my blood and in my DNA, and if this can happen to me, what does this mean for the rest of our world? And not to say I'm so mighty, but just saying, like, it just gave me this big passion for all of us and what we're all walking through every single day. And I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake this idea of kindness being the most important thing we had to heal and to unite and connect us. And so I just dove headfirst into all of that, everything tied to kindness, and eventually ended up stepping out to launch my own nonprofit, which is kindness.org.
So, well, thank you first of all, thanks for sharing that. And I know that it's like your vulnerability is really like to be commended, because I think that and I know it's a big part of like kind of your story, and I knew it. I just wanted you to share it with the audience, but if you were willing to. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. What do you think? Like, it's interesting. Like when you were describing yourself as a kid, I was like, oh, that's just like me. Like I was like a kid, or I'm like it came out differently, probably because I'm. What's your? You said immigrant. Your family of immigrants. Like who's the immigrant in your family?
My dad immigrated from Peru.
Oh, okay. So your father was born in Peru and then moved here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that. So my dad's my mother is first generation Italian, so her dad was from Italy. So I grew up with a grandfather like with a heavy Italian accent. And then my dad's side, my dad is from Iran. Like he moved here when he was in his 30s, got his MBA, and then they went back. We lived there, and then we came when they had a revolution here. But my father was like, I was like born in 1939 in like Tehran, Iran, or in Esfahan, Iran. So I used to joke, I'm like, yeah, that's like being born in 1889 in the United States. So I'm like a kid of like I was born in 78, which means like I was 13 in like the 90s, you know. So like those are like worlds apart culturally. And it's interesting when you grow up and I mean I don't know how it was where you grew up, but I grew up in Orange County, California, and so having my name is very ethnic name, Darius Mirshahzadeh. I have a super ethnic name, although my middle name is John, so everyone can go fuck themselves. But yeah, my mom's American, my dad's Persian. I'm a super ethnic name. I look different because I'm, the world was a little bit less like mixed then. So I'm pretty mixed, like you don't really know what I am when you look at me. And I grew up in a very white Christian area. And so the dude, like, yeah, we're different. Right. And it was in the 80s when people were just kind of like less, I guess, aware of a lot of the stuff we're talking about. There was a lot less awareness around like being kind and being different's okay. And like none of this shit was in the zeitgeist of like the 80s and 90s. It was like, it was way more like probably the 50s and 60s where people just talk shit to you. I was, my wife we have this esthetician who my wife goes to and I'll go to every now and again, and she's Korean, and we're in our 40s, and I'm like, I'm going to say something right now that's like not appropriate. I'm like, I grew up where like people would scream fag in the hallway of your high school. Like that's, and I have lots of friends who like they're homosexual and they're awesome. And I'm like, I knew what they grew up around. I'm like, dude, I grew up in that environment where like it was, people were just fucking unkind to each other constantly. And having grown up in an environment where like people would talk shit to me and my brother for being different, like we got bullied hard. And my reaction to that was, it's funny, like when you were describing yourself, I was thinking, you made me just think about myself a lot. And I was like, oh, I was a tough kid, dude. I was a kid that was like, anyways, where I sidetracked, but where I was going with it I was a kid that grew up, and I was like, my brother, it's like, why do you think you're going to be rich when you grow up? Right. Because I just had this confidence that I was going to do big things. And I was 5 when he said that to me, wow. And I have a twin brother. And so, but we grew up with that kind of together, and people were bullying and they were mean. And what I've noticed though was interesting. It was like, like, I think you kind of like react to the environment you're in. Some kids can naturally, like it's like fight or flight. Right. And I think like the fight is in them, and then that comes out, that warrior part of their personality. It sounds like you had that. Like this warrior, like I'm just gonna go and mess with, people mess with me, I'll mess with them back, right? Like from a physical perspective. But the interesting part about this is, I think it's 20% of the population has a neurology that's hypersensitive, like hypersensitive humans from a do you know anything about this?
No.
Yeah, so it's like your neurology, like the way you actually like a lot of artists have it actually. And my family's very artistic and very creative. So a lot of creatives have it. I don't know if you consider yourself creative or not, but 20% of the population has a hypersensitive neurology around from an emotional standpoint. Very sensitive emotionally. So I don't know if you were accused of that ever, but I have been accused of that. Like, oh, you're very like that you're actually, but because I'm kind of a tough motherfucker, they're like, it's always surprising to people. They're like, oh, you're a pretty sensitive person. And So I don't know everything you were just saying. Like, do you think that I wanted to ask you if you had that? So A, do you have that? And then B, well, let's stop there and then I'll ask you my next question.
Yeah. And I'm like, note to self, go Google this 20% neurology finding. Yeah, 1,000%. I was really sensitive, like super, super tough little fighter, became quite cruel as a way to like protect myself. And so I hurt others because I felt so hurt. But I was also I could cry over anything, and I was deeply affected by so much. So yes, I did have that. What an interesting juxtaposition to have those things growing up. And I still am quite sensitive.
Yeah, it was funny. If you're very sensitive as a kid, it can be a pretty big liability, right? Because your feelings get hurt really easily, and but the gift of that is you empathize with other people because you see other kids get hurt. And like I was a kid because I have like kind of that justice in me where I'd see other kids get hurt and I go defend them, you know. Like I can remember defending kids that were getting picked on, and then I'd get picked on and I'm like, I don't give a fuck, and then I'd just fight them. But or I would do stuff where I would like I would right that injustice at the moment, right? Because I was just that was just a big thing for me. Where I'm like, this is not okay. So it's interesting that's I knew that I figured that was there because I'm like, the only way you would react in this massive way to create this massive thing is you'd have to A, be super ambitious, but B, you'd have to be able to see. Because I think if people don't have it, they actually have no idea what the hell you and I are talking about. They say that they don't know that it's like these micro behaviors that people who have a hypersensitivity towards from an emotional standpoint, or that can read that hypersensitivity. Like you will see someone like you watch someone get stabbed by someone else. You see them bleed. And you're like, fuck, dude, that's not. And you yourself feel that way. Where other people, it's like they don't just feel it. They don't feel it the same way. And so it's both a blessing and a curse. The blessing, obviously, I think it's a it's a very painful thing to have as a young person because you don't know what to do with it, you know. And if your parent, I don't know if your parents had it or not. I usually they do because it's probably where it's going to come from. It's a genetic thing, right? Where like, and you'll see it with this by the way is one of the biggest reasons why there's so much suicide amongst artists. Because they can't live in this world, they say. Like it's like there's this. I can't remember there's a woman that came on the show, and I forget her name, but she and I had a huge conversation about this because she was doing she was studying it. She was from South America, and it's like you start to look, and then it starts to make sense when someone like a Kurt Cobain kills himself. You're like, dude, this is a dude that was like feeling a lot of stuff that numbing himself with heroin, right? And so it's not surprising that you would turn to those things because if you're hypersensitive, it's hard to escape that sensitivity. And you feel like, and if you have that like fire in your belly to like change stuff, but don't know what to do with either of those things, that's a lot of really strong emotions for a young person to feel, Yeah. And I don't, it's not surprising to me that to even like delve in those worlds like of drugs or these dopamine, like activities, because those make you feel good because you're like, fuck dude, I don't want to feel this shit. So I know how I can escape it. I get fucked up and I go have fun because I'm hypersensitive. So my fun is, by the way, one of the positives of being hypersensitive is my fun is way better than your fun. Like if you only fucking knew how good that shit feels to me. You know what I mean? Yeah, they're like, Darius, you are so fun. I'm like, yeah, you know why? Because when I get fucked up, it's way more fun than when you get fucked up. So I didn't even realize it until I just said it. I'm like, oh, that's why I like to do all that shit. It's about 2 beers. Darius is awesome. I'm like, because 2 beers for me is like 8 for you, dude. Anyhow, so I know we're running over. Do you got a few minutes to wrap up here?
Yeah, this is wonderful. So hard. I didn't know. It's like Dr. Darius is what we should call this. I feel like, wow, I'm really learning a lot about myself here.
Oh, I love that. So tell us like what's next. You guys are doing some really big stuff. at kindness.org. Like
Yeah.
I'd love for you to educate the audience on like some of the big stuff you guys are doing, how folks can get involved. Like, yeah, I'd love for you to just educate us.
Yeah. So when stepping out to start this, I was leaving a job I loved and was taking this huge gamble. And it was just like, I couldn't shake kindness. Everyone's like, kindness? Like, what is that? What do you mean you're going to go build a kinder world? How do you do that? And we, my now co-founder, he's a tech entrepreneur. We really looked at it like a business and did a competitive analysis and looked at, who's out there in the market landscape of a kinder world. And what we found is there was a huge gap between blending science into solutions. So there was a lot happening on the academic side, research groups that were studying empathy, kindness, compassion, pro-social behaviors. And then there were a lot of organizations, and not to knock any of them, but just perpetuating the softer side of kindness, the hearts and butterflies that you might conjure when you think of kindness. But at the time, especially about a decade ago, there wasn't really anyone combining forces with that. So we decided to come at this being this very authoritative voice on what it means to build a kinder world. Years 1 to 4, we're really focused on the research, laying that strong foundation. Our chief science officer has been with us since the beginning. He was with Oxford and left Oxford to join us full time. And he's an evolutionary psychologist. And so we've really answered some of the biggest, most complicated questions we have around what is kindness? How do you define it? How do you measure it? What impact do our choices really have when we do them? And we tackle complex issues as well. Like right now, we're finishing research on kindness within policing. We've been working for 2 years with a police department in the Bronx, studying the role of kindness within police relationships. So we try to take on anything and everything that is culturally relevant and also helps give us a strong framework to then activate and mobilize people. So to the listeners, the first initiative we tackled was going back to my roots, and it's called Learn Kind. So it's a kindergarten through 8th grade program serving students. We're global. We're active in all 50 states, and we've served students in more than 50 countries. So we have resources on our site for parents, families, anyone who might be struggling with children that are being bullied, anyone who wants to give their kids tools to navigate social, emotional health, which to me arguably is the most important thing to give kids, more than history and math. Our site is there and can give you everything you need to bring that into your life, your home, and the classroom if your kids are in school. And then the big thing in front of us, we're really working on giving people a way to understand kindness in their own personal relationship with it. So we've created something called the KQ, which is a kindness quotient. And it's the best of cognitive psychology, but it's a personality test. And we're going to be rolling it out later this fall in November, where you can come and get a sense of how kind you are. And we've been working on this research for years, just put the papers out for publication. And now we're developing the applied experience for anyone listening to come and learn about their relationship with kindness and then what to do about it. If you really want to create change in your own life, in the life of those around you, what can you do about it? So we're giving you that baseline and then guiding you on how to create that change. So that's what's in front of us.
Love that. That's you guys are doing such cool stuff. I'm so grateful to get to educate the audience on this today and to learn more myself. Where can people go again if they want to? What would be the best place for them to find this? I don't know if I missed that or not. Would it be the website?
Yeah, our site, kindness.org houses everything. It's where we roll out all of our research. We have a Kind Lab page, which is the research arm, and then a Get Started page, which houses all the places where you can take action and bring kindness into your life in different ways. We're very active on social. So handles are kindness.org across Instagram and Facebook, and kindness_org on X. And email. We reply to every single person that writes us. So you can email hello@kindness.org. Welcome questions, feedback, stories, anything you want to share with us.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes. So you ready for the greatness question, Jaclyn?
Let's do it.
All right. Awesome. So what is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how have you overcome it?
I think the number one barrier in business has been knowing what to say no to, or rather what to say yes to. I think I've overcome that because, in particular, this mission does touch every human and does touch every environment. And how do you cast such a wide net and still have deep impact has been the thing I've wrestled with. So how do I say no to the distractions? How do I say no to the things that take us off course? But how do I also trust my instinct to know when sometimes you have to follow the thing off course? And so I think it's been instinct and mentorship and following the impact, making sure I'm really trusting myself as a leader, and also making sure the impact is meaningful and measurable, so we know we're doing the work that matters.
I love that. Jaclyn, so fun having you on the show. So, I mean, we started off going down the rabbit hole of politics. It's funny. It's like I'm apologizing for it. I'm like, it's such a meaningful part of what's happening right now, right?
Yeah, no apology. I loved it.
And yeah, thank you for educating our audience. I'm so grateful to get to know you and to have you doing the work you're doing. And yeah, I appreciate you so much. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Darius. Truly so honored to be here. I admire you, love you. This was awesome.
Appreciate that so much. And the feeling is mutual. Guys, listen, go out there, support Jaclyn. You guys will put all the links in the show notes. And listen, this is a universal meta value, as Jaclyn said, and there's no reason you can't share this. We're leaders, we're givers. Let's share this with all the people we know. And until next time, peace out. Love you.
She's my lover.
You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on, so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers. And after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.